We have a movable microphone. Okay, great. Thank you all for joining in this workshop. I'm Rebecca Williams-Karneski. I'm an assistant professor at Northwestern University and associate program director for the general surgery residency training program. I'll just give an overview to the workshop, and then I'll let my co-presenters introduce themselves. So, disclosure, we have no financial disclosures. We've all served as volunteers for the American Board of Surgery. We have drunk the Kool-Aid on EPAs. So there's that for disclosure. I think the other disclosure that I really want to make is that we're still learning, right? We're still learning how to do this well, how to implement EPAs and generate engagement at all levels with EPAs. So one of our hopes for this workshop is that we can, though we are a large group, we can still be very interactive, and we would love to hear from you all what has gone well, areas that you are struggling with, and we hope that this can be a forum for helping generate ideas. We have some handouts that we passed out. There are 3 separate handouts. They look similar in style. We didn't have quite enough for the entire group. So if you want one and did not receive one, just let us know. We can make more copies at the end or reach out by email. The 3 handouts you should have are strategies for increasing resident engagement, strategies for increasing faculty engagement, and then using EPAs effectively in your CCC. Okay, so those are the 3, and we'll work through those. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Holmstrom.
Do you want now or no? Just when she gets up. Okay. Does this work?
I was trying to see if this works. Yeah,
I would love that. So I don't have to be like
yeah,
podium bound.
okay, it works.
Awesome. I'm Amy Holmstrom. I am first year faculty at Indiana University, and I started volunteering with the American Board of Surgery's EPH project as a research resident right after completion of the pilot. We were a pilot program. And like my colleague said, I've definitely drunk the Kool-Aid as well. I'm going to be talking to you guys about resident engagement at your program. And like she already mentioned, we understand everyone is at different phases of implementation. Your program may already be using the app and collecting a bunch of data, or using your homegrown app. You may have not yet started at all. So we really want your input. We want to find out what troubles you've struggled with locally, how you've overcome them, because we obviously have our own perspectives from our own programs, and we're just going to tell you what we think has worked so far, but we really welcome input, and we want you to talk to your neighbors and report back as a group. We were hoping to break up into smaller groups, but it's a pretty big room, so we're going to keep it big for now. So increasing resident engagement with EPAs. I wanted to start by sort of the basics, which is just investing in the development process. So investing in resident development early. So when you have, we're getting close to the end of an academic year here, you're going to have a new cohort of interns, and these interns are going to be the second class, potentially graduating with needing to submit a composite report of their EPAs in order to sit for their boards. So, you sort of have a captive audience there. You tell them it's a requirement, they're going to have to do it, right? So you start with that. And then, I would recommend, there's a lot of information on the board's website about these development tools. You should start by teaching them the language of EPAs, and we're going to go through some specific scenarios. I'll talk you through that. You should do some standard setting. So explain, this is what it looks like. This is how you evaluate it. Make sure everyone downloads the app if you use the EPA app, or if you have your own tool, and do a functionality test. And there's some how-tos, again, available on the board's website. And then we really recommend performing a check-in. So after you orient that new group of interns, schedule something 1 to 3 months in, ideally. Find out how things are going, because if you find out there's a problem, a technical problem, it seems like a lot of people are having the same issue, you want to figure that out as early as possible so they can get that culture developed and they can get that workflow built in so that it just becomes a habit from the start. Obviously, as your programs are just developing this for everyone, it's sort of easiest to start with those interns, but all of your trainees should really be doing this as well. So in the beginning, you're going to want to get every PGY year onboarded, but then those check-ins and those refreshers may end up being limited to your intern classes. And then again, like I said, soliciting feedback, troubleshooting issues, we know there's going to be issues. And just like the board has been soliciting feedback from programs over this process, you're going to need to do that at your local program. So I just want to stop there and find out if people can turn sort of to their neighbors and find out, talk a little bit about what you've done so far, where your program is at, and what issues maybe you have found so far with implementing this, and then we can come back as a group and discuss. All right, everyone, I apologize. In the interest of time, we're hoping to come back as a big group. If you guys could wrap up. And my colleagues are here with a mic, so I'd like to invite just a couple people to share with us a little bit about what you heard from your colleagues and what's going on at your institution, maybe something you learned from a peer.
So my name's Kenneth Lee. I'm from the University of Pennsylvania. So one thing we talked about was who initiates EPAs, because at our institution, at least, I think our faculty probably would do it, although I sometimes view them as an obstacle, but they are very adamant that the residents should initiate it. And then the residents, I'm not sure what they think about it in terms of whether they see the utility or not, but you can get into this little thing like who's going to initiate this, like who's in charge. And I think that's one thing that we struggle with a little bit.
Great. So I think we'll come at this from both the faculty and the resident side. Do you want me to just collect comments and then you'll summarize? Do you want to answer now?
No, we can do
Use more
another
comment.
comment.
What else? What else did people learn?
So at our table, there were some people that were very thoughtful about how they wanted to implement it, like they just did ones and twos. Others of us wanted to just sort of blast it out, and neither worked well. Not in this.
Did you say neither worked well? Oh, good.
Keep it up. Yes.
Realized we both have the same question, one from the community standpoint of sending residents out to another program for trauma rotations and one from receiving other residents. Do the residents get dual listed under both? Because like I have a list of my residents, but I don't have a list of the visiting residents. And how does that work for residents who say do their trauma rotation at a different program?
Yeah, I think, and that's something that maybe even Dr. Mellinger would be able to answer, but from an app standpoint, you should be able to have visiting residents listed as a faculty member who's evaluating. You should have those visiting residents. Any resident that comes to visit you should be in your app to be able to evaluate. And I believe that if they're not, that you have the ability to fix that. Someone I think has a comment.
I just wanted to edit my comment that one thing that that we talked about it in our group is that we don't understand why they're not uptaking it, because it is easy and it is like, it seems like what they want. And so we struggled both in simple and in the EPAs to understand that.
Yes, so
Like-
that's going to be the next, I'm going to try to be quick because we have so much to do, but that's going to be my next thing, which is teaching residents, explaining to residents why they should buy into this, why they should really do it. First thing, of course, being this is a requirement, you have to, but I think the more important part is why there are so many benefits to this, which is why the board decided to use this tool. So let's talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, and hopefully we'll have a little time at the end, and I'm happy to answer any questions offline as well. So I love this quote: resentment occurs when you fail to meet an expectation that I didn't tell you I had. So I stole this from Dr. Lindemann. So, you know, residents don't understand what their expectations are when they're working with a faculty member and you do a cholecystectomy with how many different attendings, and everyone might want something a little different. And how are you going to be evaluated at the end? So EPAs are helping standardize that, and there's behavioral anchors that are written. So it really helps sort of level the playing field here and make trainees have a clue of what they're expected to do. So again, that one of the values I think with EPAs is right now, this is what the type of feedback they get. If it's negative, it feels like this judgment, like you are as a person are bad, or you as a surgeon are not good, right? These are really, they feel really critical. And so what we love about EPAs is that it creates this judgment-free zone. Instead of you didn't do well, your technical skills aren't up to par, it's you need help doing this specific portion of this case. And it's a behavior that's written and it's something they just observed, and it's a one-time thing. You can have a bad day, right? And you can do better the next time. So this takes the subjectivity out of it, and it really makes that feedback feel less harsh and less critical and less permanent. Like, I am bad. Maybe this case didn't go great. Maybe tomorrow or literally the next case I can do better. And so I'm gonna, in the interest of time, speed through this, but you know, everyone should be familiar by this point with limited participation, direct supervision, indirect supervision, and practice ready. Those are our 4 levels. And what I like to call the entrustment language. This is a shared language we are all going to use and speak. And I think having that shared language is a true benefit of this evaluation framework as well. And so the benefits to trainees: everyone's going to have that same language. You can talk to your attending and say, I'd really like to get to indirect supervision for this case. And eventually you will all know what that means for a cholecystectomy if that's something you perform frequently. And I think that one of the things I talk about a lot is how this can empower a trainee to have a conversation in advance of a case and say, this is actually what I'm hoping to do, and it's backed in X data. And so I'm going to, again, in the interest of time, I'm going to go towards a little further here. in different discussions about how a trainee can do this. So they can, if it's a chief resident, and depending on, you know, what your hospital looks like, where I trained, I might have an attending who takes call every other month, and he doesn't normally do emergency general surgery cases, and I haven't operated with him for a year. So if I'm a chief resident, I can look at my data and say, hey, in the last month, I've done 15 lap appies, 5 different surgeons, and I've been practice ready. So I'm coming, this, you know, surgeon's coming in and he hasn't done a lap appy with me in a long time. And I can say, hey, you know, Dr. Williams, I've done 15 lap appies with 5 of your partners in the past month, and I've been practice ready. And then asked to do what teaches us. Can I take the P2x2 through this case? And how much more powerful is that versus that attending coming in and being like, I haven't operated with you in a year and it's a night call case. I'm just going to do this thing, right? So we've all been there. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on and let my colleagues take over. I think we're going to talk about faculty feedback next. And again, I'm happy to talk more later.
So the handouts, again, we can also make those available after the workshop if you didn't get one, but they walk through all the strategies that we will be talking about. There is space underneath the strategy for you to write in your own ideas to try at your institution. And if you look at them now, so just take a minute and look at the handouts. So you have an idea of what's there. So first, it has a strategy that we recommend. And this is a lot of work that came out of the best practices working group data that we generated on the pilot. It has an example of one way you could do this, not the only way that you can do this, and then an explanation for reasons why this works to help you generate some additional ideas. So again, I wish we had like 3 hours for this workshop, because what we'd really like to do is give you a plan to take back to your institution. In lieu of that, we have some recommendations that you can also fill out independently, and we're all happy to be available as resources to talk through this. So thank you so much, Amy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about increasing faculty engagement with EPAs. And I think this gets at that, the question that came up too about like who initiates an EPA. I think the best strategy is both. Really, and what we saw in the pilot is institutions that were most successful had both faculty and residents empowered, right, to initiate EPAs. But you have to be very clear about the expectations. And so these are my 5, hot takes on what you can do. There's way more for sure, but I'll kind of talk about why each of these works. And I would say a lot of my approach to thinking about and what we saw in the pilot study, what the data would tell us is that you have to set up a framework and scaffold the ability for these things to get done. You have to make it easy in the environment to do the work, right? That's a huge barrier to getting these types of things done. So the first recommendation is clearly defining the scope of requests to faculty around EPAs. How many people in this room have done that? Have like looked through your rotations and said which EPAs faculty are responsible for? Okay. How many of you how did you do that process? Can we have 1 or 2 people maybe talk about how you did it? Just like top down, did you get a division chief?
We divided them up as part of one of our PEC discussions and then took it to our next faculty meeting.
Yeah. Anybody else do it different ways? So you took it to the faculty meeting, like with the divisions? Awesome.
We kind of broke it down. One of our APDs broke it down based on the rotation, kind of where we thought we could get the EPAs, some of them being very easy on any rotation, some of them being much more difficult. So we assigned those difficult ones to specific rotations.
Huge. So I think this is a great strategy to think about. And this is when you're constructing that whole schedule. So if your residents only do their breast rotation as a PGY2 and they only spend a month on breast, they really have to work on maximizing their numbers during that rotation, right? Maybe they'll pick up a few others, but so you have to be very deliberate in that planning. This is also a great practice for community programs that are sending your residents to other locations. So you want them to do trauma there. Also think about, is this the place that they can get their trauma EPA and how many? And you have to communicate clearly with the faculty at that institution as well. So it takes a little upfront work in the coordination, but really important. What are some other strategies people have used to define that scope? Oh, yeah.
Speaking as a traumatologist and care surgeon, we looked at the distribution of EPAs per division. They may get a little bit of everything on our service, but focus more on trauma and this like recurrent care aspect, putting something all the way on one.
Yeah. So one of the barriers that we saw in the EPA pilot project was that divisions like acute care surgery were basically being empowered to do all of the EPAs, which is too many, and they felt very overwhelmed, and they were active, and they're very active part of resident education, but it's too much. So think about how you can offload to make it equitable, because faculty will want it to be equitable as well, reasonably so, right? And so one of the things you might think about is small bowel obstruction. Yeah, you see it on acute care, but do you also see that on your colorectal surgery service? Probably. So maybe you can have that EPA be on your colorectal surgery service. So it takes a little work, but thinking about that and looking at that is really important. The other next recommendation in this goal setting is engage faculty in the goal setting. So engage faculty, and I would say engage residents too. So this is in both of the resident and faculty portion, but how many EPAs are people responsible for? And there are different ways to break this down and set this up. Have people set EPA targets? Who has set EPA targets? Dr. Brazel, do you want to? EPA a day. And is that EPA for clinic, EPA for OR, EPA for service day? Yes. Yes, that's exactly it. One EPA per day. And that is a lot of EPAs over a rotation. That's like, it's a lot of math to do right now. So but there are different ways to do this. So you can set targets, and you can be explicit with these targets for residents that they're evaluated on, right? Check in, monitor their progress. Targets for faculty. Okay. When you're doing this work, the other thing that's really important, and Amy didn't get to spend a lot of time, but definitely she found this in the work with residents, empowering champions. So programs who are involved in the pilot who had resident champions and faculty champions had much more engagement, right? Because the people who are doing this are the stakeholders. They want to be engaged in the process of implementing this. It is helpful to get their insight, because it can say, like, as an APD, like, here's what I think you should be doing, but I'm not doing that daily work. So this is really important. There's also an opportunity as a champion to get more resources, additional resources from the Board of Surgery to get linked in. So recommend this too for both residents and faculty. And this is a really important part of those goal setting conversations, right? Have your champion be part of that too. Yes.
Like, what do I do? So do you have ideas of things that we should be doing or not doing with the
Yeah.
champions based on your experience? And then I have champions for the residency side. I have not been able to identify a champion on the faculty side, but I'm assuming that you're going to tell me to do that too. So I just
Yeah.
thoughts and help, please.
Yeah. So I think, again, if you can give them a specific task, because you say, be a champion. EPAs are great. You know, like, what does that mean? So as much as you can do to be very specific about your ask, it's like making an EPA for being an EPA champion. Maybe we should do that. But so help me define the scope. Help me talk to divisions and go to division meetings for me, see what EPAs they think are within their realm of expertise. Talk to the divisions about what EPAs they think, how many are reasonable to do. Right? So have them help you do that legwork and find those areas. Right? Same for residents. What education do the residents need? What are you guys feeling like you're struggling with? So they can help be the needs assessment people, and then they can be the idea generation for solutions. That's my view of the champions. They don't have to be total experts, but they can understand your local climate. You bring information, go out there, get the information. Yeah. Yeah. And then also, then when you start setting up, So if the resident says, okay, we don't know if we should submit or the faculty, then you ask them, do you want to submit their faculty? Say, sure, yeah, we want both, or how are you going to break that up? And if they have the suggestion for what the solution is, have them help you in that solution generation piece. Incentivization of EPA completion. Do any programs here incentivize EPA completion? I saw a hand. How do you do that? Money. I've seen this. We saw this actually in one of the best practices in one of the pilot programs. It was through the consult, and it was ED providers got money for doing EPAs. Tie it to like educational value units. Okay, that's one way. How else? Okay.
So we didn't do that yet, but we will. They are informed since the beginning, and they do have a history because in our program, the milestones and the evaluations from faculty are already incentivized. So they do know we will make it starting July. The EPAs will have a component which will be related to, yes, you are doing it, great, you get money. No, you're not doing it, you're not for getting the money. So it actually works for
Yeah.
about 50% of faculty. It's a really good motivator.
Yeah.
Or reminder.
I'm from the University of Oklahoma City. And those of you who heard my talk at the ACS know I publicly challenged the program director and chair of the Oklahoma University of Tulsa to a competition. So we're engaged in a battle.
So that's another thing that we also saw in the pilot that institutions did that actually was really successful. And Indiana University does this, just leaderboards, like who is doing well, who's not doing well. Talk about, celebrate those exemplars. I'm more of the like, celebrate the exemplars than just really show the people who aren't doing anything. But that is also a strategy. People do the shame method, right? You have completed 0 EPAs. Is one method that some institutions used effectively, quite frankly, in the pilot. So even having those competitions between the residents, I think that's something you do at Indiana University, where they like have monthly competitions. Whoever does the most gets a prize. I don't know, Starbucks. Divisions compete. So you can kind of gamify this too. That may work as an incentive. The other incentive that's really great besides money or like just a friendly competition is taking away other work, right? So, yeah.
How can divisions compete when the EPAs are so, the EPAs are different, right? Between the divisions. It's impossible for acute care surgery to be competing with breast. They just don't have. So how do you compete?
Yeah, so you have to do you have to like normalize it. So say you're like, so if you have, surgical oncology, they're going to do less operations per day probably than if you have high volume acute cares, just doing a bunch of APPs and gallbladders. Yeah, normalize per interaction or something like that. You can normalize per case number is one way to do it. I think there's many creative ways.
Or as an average.
Yeah.
Incentive. Our department, we have these track metrics, TRAC. T is teaching, research, academic, C is citizenship. And for citizenship, as an example, 0.5% of your base salary is withheld unless 90% of the population is done. And for the TRAC, that's teaching, research, academic, you gotta get your name on the paper each year. Research, and the teaching aspect, we expect every faculty to participate in one interview session, to participate in a mock oral session.
Yeah.
And just thinking about it, as we think about what our track metrics are next year, we need to say, hey, one of your track metrics will be to do 4 EPAs over the course of the year. Something, some day, like one day, which is great, but like, I think it's very easy.
Yeah, and then you just like bump that up every year. Yeah. Yeah, we do the same thing, and completion of resident end of rotation evaluations is linked into that metric of the education, which is, again, it's like, like 0.5%. But it's enough to incentivize people to do it. And so EPAs is not currently on it, but that's one that we're gonna.
The concern that is that, in order to add EPAs to this. In order to add EPAs to this, I would almost feel compelled to get rid of something else, because I don't want to keep adding things on.
Yeah.
I would almost get rid of the end of rotation evaluations and just say, just do the EPAs.
Yeah.
Because if we have enough EPAs, we don't need technically the end of rotation evaluations.
And so this is one thing that I think it's actually a really interesting concept that we're looking at, and at IU, they're doing this is incentivizing if you do the narrative comments in the EPA. So not just the numbers, but add a little narrative comment, then you can actually, that's much richer data than usually people give on a summative evaluation, right? Because the EPA, they say, use your left hand more when you're retracting, or you didn't have coordinated use of both hands during that cholecystectomy. End of rotation evaluation, they say, did a good job in the OR. Right. So if you can just extract that information from multiple EPAs and use that as part of to build a summative evaluation, quite frankly, for our medical students, they have EPAs, and the richer portion of their narrative for the clerkship evaluation comes from the EPAs they do rather than the summative thing. So there's work ongoing to look at the comparison of quality. I think there's a couple comments. I saw Dr. Millinger and also Dr. Tatebe. Yeah. Yeah. It. And thank you for bringing up the end of rotation evaluation. That's what I hear. It says you don't have to complete the full end of rotation evaluation, or maybe you can do it as a group evaluation, so some other, because it's still important in the EPAs don't cover all the milestones. There are like 3 they don't cover.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the narratives, which I agree with you completely, are incredibly rich. The trick, if the residents are implementing the EPAs and they're sending them to me, I don't remember which case they're talking about. Right. And so like sometimes I'm saying it's the right thing, maybe I'm not. So like I found, at least for me, if I'm the one actually doing it, like I just sort of think it as like, okay, I did my op note, now I'm going to do my EPA and just send it to them in the operating room as they're closing. Then at least I know what case it is. I got one from one of my residents like 2 days after I work with her, and I'm like, I don't know which one you want me to do, but I'll just pick one and do it. But I feel like I think you're losing it if you put it too much on the residents to initiate all of them.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And that's where you can have kind of a bias too in your assessment, right? Which is what we're trying to eliminate, right? So the case that was really terrible stands out, or the case that went really well stands out, right? But those other ones that were like pretty much just straightforward and did well, but weren't exceptional in any way, maybe get forgotten. Yes.
No matter what the level, I'd love to change this, but I don't know that it's going to be that easy. No matter what the level of the resident, the way the faculty fill out evaluations is they anchor the level of the resident to the evaluation. So chiefs are 4. Chiefs are practice ready, chiefs or whatever. If you're a 2nd-year resident, you can't be practice ready. And yet at the same time, we have rotations that we really don't do after 2nd year, like breast. So if a resident's not practice ready when they're a 2nd year, then I guess they will never be. So at some point in time, there's going to be, I guess, some come to Jesus moment where we label what level all residents have to achieve. And I guess I have some concerns that it might fall apart at that point because we're going to have residents that never got called practice ready because they were second years and now they're ready to graduate. So I'm
And
kind of curious what we're going to do about
Yeah,
that.
I think there's, to be determined is the full answer, but I think what I would tell your faculty in the meantime is to not do that. Don't just pick all fours, because we have the same problem with EPAs on the medical student side, and we just had a grand rounds to discuss this too, because people do that. They say, oh, they're a third year medical student, they're threes. And we're like, but we set the psychometrics, the School of Medicine sets the parameters for what is appropriate for performance based on each individual question. So I would tell your faculty, look at the behaviors. Which behaviors are they enacting? Base your evaluation on the behaviors that they are enacting. If they are practice ready, maybe it's a lipoma, then as a 2, great. So I think that's what I would say for that. And I'm gonna move forward again. Fast forward.
I'll
Go
just
ahead.
say one point about that as well is that actually Dr. Linneman has data, I believe it was out of her institution, that showed that the earlier PGY level residents for preoperative phases and postoperative phases were showing practice ready earlier because that's what they're doing a lot in the junior phases. And honestly, every single program is different, right? Do your PGY 3s get some really early operative experience, or maybe some of your PGY 2s are doing a lot of autonomous stuff, whereas some programs, they're really not doing a ton of those more autonomous operative cases until they're 4s and 5s. And it's not even fair to compare different programs because at your program, your PGY 3s might be stuck at direct supervision for a cholecystectomy, where my program as a PGY 3, I've been doing them autonomously already, right? So I think you have to think about what is local to you and your institution, and remind your faculty members to actually read those behavioral anchors and think about, is it pre-op, is it intra-op? And every program is going to be different. So just think about that.
The last thing for faculty too that I'll say is feeding forward data, but this ties into the CCC stuff. And
Any word on what the eventual requirement is going to be? And the reason I ask is because this year it was like, if you're doing EPAs, then your board application got easier and everyone's like, cool, that's great. But then in like 5 years, what's the requirement even going to look like?
Experts.
I'll take a stab, and I'd love to hear Karen's thoughts too. So I think we're learning right now. We don't know how all these are going to perform. And I think we'll be able to define this better in a couple of years as we see what the national trends are and whether people are really using them, to your point, without a ceiling effect, like everybody's got to get. Well, that'll be no use. That'll be like an attestation, right? If that's what we do. We expect to find out that not all perform the same and that not every resident, what we would like everybody to be practice ready, but we want that to be an honest assessment. So I think the main thing I would strive for is, like with any assessment tool, the more you use it, the more the more raters and the more assessments, the more reliable. And using a number like we've talked about, how if you get 2 a week on every resident, they'll have 500 at the end of 5 years. That's literally like 2 minutes of faculty time. So, or if you get to what Karen was talking about, that'll be a huge body of data. And then we'll know how to interpret, because we'll get meaningful analytics out of it.
The only thing I will add is this is an active topic of conversation, and the assessment committee of the ABS Council is working on the principles that will be used to answer Rahul's question, and that those principles need to work for not only our general surgery residents, but also the fellowships. What the exact, is it going to be 80% practice ready? Is it going to be in phase? We don't and won't have the answers to those questions early to avoid the just rubber stamp effect, but we are actively working on the principles and the framework.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Christina Booth. I said I'm from the University of Oklahoma, Oklahoma City, and I'm here because it's that time of year again. Everyone's excited and gearing up for their spring CCC meeting. All your faculty will come together and there'll be all this agreement, and it'll take 30 minutes, right? Well, I'm not gonna probably fix all of that. And I'll be honest, so our next CCC meeting is in a couple of weeks, and our last one was about 1 week before they announced that the milestone dashboard was ready. So I have some theoretical ideas on how we're gonna try and put this into practice. And I wanna make sure that you all know what data you have available to use in your next CCC meeting. And hopefully, if you all are some of the overachievers that have more than your required 2 CCC meetings and have already done one with the EPA data, you're who we want to hear from. So first of all, how you can get your data and what you can get. So when you log on to the EPA reports website, you have to be logged in as a program administrator. And so for most of you, the default is your program coordinators. But I had to walk my program coordinators through how to do this. They're great, but they might not have seen where this is yet. And you can request as a program director or APD to get that access from help@simple.org, and they will give you access to the program administrator website part 2. So the first thing you do is go to your reports, user reports. You'll have to put in your program, obviously, and filter by trainees. And then you'll have a list of your residents. You pull up one resident, and this is the picture that will come up. And you have 2 buttons down here for groupings. There's no groupings, there's an activity groupings, and there's a milestone grouping. And then once you pick which one you want, and I'm going to show you what those 2 look like here on the next slide, you then click export and it gives you an Excel spreadsheet. So there is a little bit of upfront work from a program coordinator or champion to kind of extrapolate and put together all the data. But if you saw Dr. Mellinger's talk this morning, you know that maybe by fall CCC meetings, there is more on the horizon for other dashboards that we'll get to use. So if you choose the activity milestone, the activity grouping, you'll get a report that looks kind of like this. And so I've taken one random 4th year resident, and I've gotten all of their inguinal hernia intraoperative assessments. And so some programs will use this for their CCC meeting, and they'll say, let's look at all these inguinal hernia intraops and let's decide together, or if you've got a large CC like us, we kind of split up who does 3rd years, who does 4th years, things like that, and see what we think, what level we think they're at. And so this one, I've taken off for privacy, the feedback that you might have looked at, the dates, and then also, of course, we add in case logs and other end of rotation evaluations, things like that. You look at these and say, well, these were harder cases done more recently. I think they're a direct supervision level. And so then you can look at what direct supervision for an inguinal hernia intraoperative does for what milestones that maps to. But if you pull up the milestone grouping, which is what I actually like better, you can group by the milestone. So I've sorted the same resident by their milestone MK2, medical knowledge. You can see several different EPAs come up, inguinal hernia intraoperative, gallbladder intraoperative, and I've sorted them by level. So we have a few 2s, but we got a bunch of 3s and a bunch of 4s, mostly in straightforward cases. So we might come to a conclusion of that's probably about a 3.5 or so. And so certainly there's other things that, these aren't going to stand alone, and there are some milestones that aren't represented in the EPA. But the hope is that maybe this gives you a grounded source for what you're going to be able to talk about and where you're going to start with your discussions. The other thing I like to do is I put the competencies up there during the CCC meeting. I say, if your comment doesn't relate to one of these competencies, this is what we have to talk about today. And reiterating kind of what is our purpose for these CCC meetings and how are we going to accomplish them? And this hopefully gives you some hard data to start with, at least in your discussions. The other thing, I'm sure several of you have seen some of the studies about bias mitigation and gender bias, and maybe even some anchoring and recency bias by giving you some harder data. What some CCC groups have done, I think Wisconsin has noted that you can blind these completely. You can just give them as resident 1 is a PGY4, and you can take the names out. And if you might have to play with the feedback and making sure that's anonymous enough, but you can potentially give anonymous feedback or determine an anonymous level for your resident before even revealing who that is. And then kind of the last thing I wanted to really talk about was how many of you have sat there in the CCC meeting and had all the faculty are like, this resident's not very good. They just aren't. They can't do this or that. They're not very good. And then you go to write they're like, they need a corrective action plan. And you go to write it and you're like, how am I going to write? They're not very good in a corrective action plan and make it into something that is measurable and tangible. And so using these EPAs backwards, saying, okay, this is the milestone we decided they're deficient at. Here are some behaviors from your EPAs that we need to see to get you to advance. So you can specify what deficiencies they have, create individual learning plans, and maybe hopefully identify some struggling residents sooner if we get our faculty, you know, kind of off what we were talking about earlier, that PGY2s are practice ready. If they really start to anchor in those observable behaviors, we're hoping that maybe we see some struggling residents a little bit sooner than, I don't know, my program, it's usually like they get to 4th year and all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, there's no one above them to cover for them anymore. Some trends you can do with this is to, you can see your faculty trends during your CCC meeting. It looks like these faculty members aren't doing enough feedback or even not giving enough autonomy. And so that's an option for your faculty development. We're pretty close to being out of time here. Actually, we're a little bit over. So I want to draw you all attention again. If you want to learn more and have more opportunities, the ABS has a webinar coming up. Here's your QR code to register for it. But I would like to hear if anyone has any other ideas for what you're going to do with your CCC meetings, or if you've already used the EPA in your CCC meetings, how'd it go? There's some reports that it decreased the time used in CCC meetings. And so I love spending all that time with the faculty talking about residents, but maybe sometimes a little bit shorter would be great. Anyone done this yet? Anyone have any other plans for good ideas you have that you want to share for how to use it? Well, we'll report back. Yes.
And you
Thank-
you may hear more about it if you take this QR code and log into the webinar. I'm guessing you're going to hear from some folks. I know Brianne Nickel at my program, IU, does a lot of amazing work with this data. And she might be able to teach some of your coordinators how to take this data and put it into graphical format, spreadsheet format, so you can actually really see visuals. She's done amazing things. So I know she's open and willing to chat with folks. And we're happy to chat. I know there's more workshops going on elsewhere. I know Dr. Williams has one in this room after. So in the interest of time, yeah, feel free to stay for the next one, and we're available.
Thank you.
Probably put them on here, not just here. That's EPA workshop, but I thought they said they put them up and just minimize them. Did they get closed accidentally? We had uploaded slides for this, but I don't see them here now. There was another set that was for interview workshop. I don't know if they got accidentally closed. Oh, yeah, great. That's great. Yeah, great.
Yeah, on the end.
Great.
And then if the slider doesn't work, then we'll just.
Yeah.
Okay.
When it's talking about creating action, and that which say like you think people are easy values, so you do right before you have your exam. I was going to say a couple words about how to write them, kind of basically, and there I think there's like 2 slides on the about.
That's fine. Figure it out. Okay, that's fine. All right, good afternoon. We move into our next workshop. Also represented by the great Rebecca Williams, who is our APD over at Northwestern. I'm Leah Tatebe, I'm the program director at Northwestern, and then Mackenzie Kruger is our program manager. And the honking, or is the extra guests. So we will just keep you on your toes from that standpoint. In terms of financial disclosures, other speakers do not. I am a paid proctor from Intuitive, but that is not relevant to what I'm going to be talking about today. So the point of this workshop is really to try to figure out how to identify your within the applicants to your program, which ones you feel like are going to be the right fit. Okay? We take great pride in the culture that we've built within our program, and really want to bring in people who represent who we are, how we want to grow, and move really our program forward. So the way that we've actually done that is working on trying to identify the core values of our program, and then using our standardized questions within our interview process to try to identify the applicants that really represent who we are and where we want to grow. And took some of this data from the business literature of trying to identify organizations' core values. And a couple key points of it is that they have to resonate within teams. They're exemplified by leadership, which I think is probably going to be a theme that comes up through this. They've got to be easy to understand, relevant day to day, and easy to identify. And the easy to identify can be a little bit tricky to put into words, but I think it's going to be fairly relevant or reminiscent of certain things of you don't quite know how to describe it, but you know it when you see it. Those are kind of your core values of trying to figure out where what you really want to focus on within your organization. And it really helps kind of bring everything into alignment. So as you're thinking about what your core values are, what you want to recruit, you can think about like what makes you who you are. So for example, we focus a lot on an academic perspective. We are a required 7-year program. So we're going to be looking for a very different group of applicants than more of a community-based 5-year program to go through. So that's part of our core values in terms of what we want to do. Who do we want to be, right? This doesn't necessarily have to be where you are now, but where do you want to grow? Where do you feel like it's that you want to be better, looking at other organizations and say, you know what, I want to emulate that. That's really kind of what I want to build and grow. And so recruiting the right people in to help facilitate that can be really helpful. So I took us some examples of common core values. I want you to take a look at this list, and then the next thing we're going to do is move over to a Slido app. So get your phones ready. I'll put up a QR code for this. But when we're looking at common core values, the business world really breaks this down into 4 realms. First is looking at integrity. We all want integrity in our residents. That's an easy one. But what does that truly mean? What part of that is what you want to focus on? Is it self-awareness? Is it open-mindedness, respect, trust? What part of that integrity do you want to draw on? Other aspect would be goal-oriented. So if you are potentially, working in an area where you have resource limited care, maybe being cost conscious is an area, or if you have an area with a bunch, have aspects of global health is a huge part of it, figuring out ways that you can do that. People oriented, right? We all work within teams. We really need to have good communication. DEI can be in here as well. Different levels for advocacy. And then of course, then the being better, trying to figure out, is social justice part of what your goal is within the organization, innovation, things like that. So for us, that's something that we put in there from the research standpoint. So here's your QR code to go to the Slido. I'm going to ask you 3 questions to kind of think on what your core values are, and then we'll go through kind of an exercise of how could you come up with the questions that you might want to ask your applicants to your program. So I'm going to switch over to, there we go. So what core values exemplify who you are as a department of residency? And this should pop up as you fill out. You can put in multiple things. So compassion, clinical excellence, love that. Family, great. We're very excited. We welcomed 2 babies into our residency last week within 24 hours. 2 of our clinical residents delivered within 24 hours of each other. It's so cute. Team, intellectual honesty, integrity, curiosity, reliable, self-motivated. These are great. Giving back to the community, I love that. Perfect. So are these things, thinking about it, like how do you actually identify these within your applicants? Trying to figure that out. Good. All right, we're going to move on to the next one. Let's see, I'm going to have to make it work on here. All right, what are you trying to grow? Where do you think maybe that there's something that you're saying, you know what, in the next 5-year plan, what part of your program do you feel like you're really trying to recruit to improve? Definitely need some rural access, right? We heard yesterday about the ACGME requirement change, trying to have involvement in that. DEI, intrinsic motivation, I love that. Retention, okay. Growing research, working on wellness, servant leadership, love that. Global health. So are these things that you can then use, and maybe not necessarily saying that you're there yet, but can you use this as part of your pitch to applicants, saying, this is really what we're focusing on to try to grow? Right. And to our last question. Where do we struggle the most? So think about this, we looked at this in a couple of ways. We have what we call like a NETS program, so Bill of Midas or basically any kind of patient safety reporting. I have the joy as PD of getting every single write-up that involves a surgical resident every day as it comes in. It's a wonderful morning report. It's nice when I get to wake up and not have one. But think about the kind of things that come up in those or interpersonal issues within your program. I saw retention was something that came up earlier, something you're trying to improve. So that could be something that you struggle with. But really kind of figuring out where are your sticking points. Maybe you're looking at your ACGME survey and saying, okay, where are my opportunities for improvement? Okay, things like that. Faculty engagement. Yeah, we have no idea what that's like. Or yeah, that's a big one. Unfortunately, it's hard to recruit applicants to improve faculty engagement. But I think we got some possible ways to do it. Feedback, scholarly activity, autonomy, wellness, professionalism, realistic expectations of future career. Now that's a fun conversation to have. Okay. Lack of self-awareness, right. Hope we all see that, I mean, a lot of this looks very familiar to me too, right? And you're not alone in these struggles. And so you can be very intentional about who you're trying to recruit based off of the things that you're trying to improve. So now we've got core values of who we are, the path in which where we want to go, and then also where we're struggling the most. And you can have a sense of how much of a focus in your recruitment and your interview process do you want to have on each of those. So switch back. So again, going back to the common core values, a lot of these did come up. And it's a question of really kind of, what do you want to do with it? So for ours, we wanted to, decide on how many values do you want to do? How do you structure your interview session? So who here does group interviews? Couple, other people, just individual one-on-ones, most people in there? Yeah, a little bit of both. So, or maybe a combo. So how do you want to do this? So do you want to focus on one particular core value within one session, which is how we run it? Or do you want to have a group session that really tries to tease out a couple of them, or go back and forth? There's not one right way to do this, but just depends on how long your day is, how much you want to break it down into, which particular values you want to focus on, and then you can divvy it up. So I'm going to bring Dr. Williams up to talk about how do you actually develop these questions.
So how many people have written interview questions before? Okay, excellent. Well, good. I'll hear your feedback. How do you have a process for how you do it? Does anybody want to be brave and talk about how you do it? I saw like maybe a hand. Oh, okay.
I did a fair amount of reading from the business literature to kind of develop a framework for it, and then did something similar where it wasn't as explicit as core values, but that was the underlying theme, to try to ask questions that, pulled that out of the applicant, but also have a handful in there to see how they think on their feet. So like things that they're not expecting to be, asked, like pretend like I'm blind and describe the color blue to me, stuff like that. So I can see like, what is your critical thinking? How is your communication, watching their face turn bright red and, trying to navigate that unexpected question.
Yeah, so that's great. So that's using a combination of behavioral and situational interviewing. So the idea behind behavioral interviewing is future behaviors can be somewhat predicted by past behavior. So you're asking them for examples. So tell me about a time in which this you were in this situation, what did you do? And you're extrapolating that forward. And then situational is how did they respond to these questions in real time? So you can use a combination of those with value-based interviews, right? And you just have to center them and be explicit in your creation of the questions about what you're asking. And so these are just the really basic steps. I would just want to take a high level view of from how do we get from this idea is really cool to actually creating them in a way that's creating a high quality question. So from a psychometric perspective, so one, you want to develop your interview questions using subject matter experts, right? So your stakeholders, your residents, your faculty, your chair, division chiefs, these are all important people to include in this. You want to develop some backup probe questions. And we'll go into this as we kind of work through this too, to say, like, I have my basic question that I'm going to ask, but what's my follow-up to that to get a little bit more information, a little bit more of a nudge in there. You really need to develop a rating scale. And this can be one of the hardest things. And we'll go through developing some question stuff, and then we'll talk about developing a rating scale. And this is kind of like, as much as you can do to make this behaviorally anchored. And kind of, if you were in the EPA session before, it's very similar. You have to be really explicit about this, because just saying good, not good, somewhere in between, people interpret that to mean many different things as interviewers. So as explicit as you can be about what good performance means in answering the question. The other thing that's really important with these, especially, is, and it takes work from other people. So getting people involved in this is really important. Pilot the questions. How do they land? How are people who are your potential interviewees going to interpret this? Maybe they see the question differently than you think in your head when you write it. You think you're asking one thing, and then they give you a response and you're like, where did that come from? They are interpreting the question differently. So you have to try these out, and it's really trial and error, and say, is the answer they're giving me representing what I'm trying to get at with the question? And then the whole interview process too. And we'll talk, you'll see why I'd say interview process, because we do suggest linking questions to create a facilitated conversation. That's a model that's worked really well for us. You also have to develop your interviewer's guide, because the whole point of standardized interviews is standardized. So they have to ask them in the same way, in the same order. And so we do link questions and recommend they're done that way, and use the rating scale, which we provide. Some basic principles for developing your questions are to really focus on open-ended questions. We do this pretty well, I think, in clinical medicine mostly. Maybe not anymore. Sometimes we get really specific. But so nothing that they can say yes. Do you like the color blue? Yes. Right. What is your favorite color? Blue. Why? That's a question and a probe. Very different response. I like blue because the sky is blue. Okay. Use real life situations. You say, oh, that's too bad. You're never going to see this guy again. Just kidding. Use real life situations as much as you can. So if you can anchor this in things that they've either done in their past life or that you want to interpret, try to be clear and concise. I mean, an interview is a high pressure situation, right? So you want to set your interviewees up for success. You want to have answers that are meaningful, right? So be concise, avoiding jargon. Also, at the same time, try to avoid questions that point directly to a correct answer as much as you can, which is hard, which is where the practicing the questions to see, is everybody giving me the same answer to this question? If I ask 5 different residents this question, do they all tell me the exact same thing? Maybe this is not a broad enough or open-ended up question. Superlatives. So this is, tell me about the hardest, whatever. Tell me about the worst, the most challenging. So that can help you to bring these extremes of experience out and maybe give you a little bit richer story from that. And then it's really important to not assess anything that's not job related, especially protected characteristics. And this is the other reason why it's really important to have a group review your questions. You may not notice that there's potentially some bias there, or maybe you're getting into an area that is like asking about family life, right? Which you really shouldn't ask, like about children or something like this, just to be clear on that. So I'm gonna have Dr. Jatebi come back up, and she's gonna give some examples of questions to kind of show you how to do some of this example question. Any questions about this at this point, or comments about questions and writing questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Sure, yeah, we do, and I tell them this at the start of the day, we'll talk a little bit
Yeah.
about it. But, I tell them, we try not to tell them too early that they're getting standardized questions. You'll see, we try to protect what our standardized questions are, because as soon as it gets out to the Reddit forum, now, great, that's wonderful, now you're not gonna have great answers. We have 4 core characteristics that we're looking for. And each of those has one person that asks those questions. So all of the applicants go through those 4. They then meet with me, they meet with our chair, and they meet with Mackenzie for, that's kind of unstructured, although I ask the same question to everybody. But it's more of a leading or sort of a get to know you thing. And then they have completely unstructured time with the residents. So as to get to know you. So it's a little bit of both.
And within each room, so it's 20-minute interviews with each faculty member. There's often a little time, and we try to ask the faculty to leave some time at the end for the applicants to ask questions or allow the faculty to ask additional questions of the resident that are off of the standardized form. So we try to bring a little bit in of non-standardized, right, to just get another sense and another opportunity for the residents or the applicants to present themselves as they might want to. Read another.
Did you get any pushback from your faculty about this standardized approach? We're kind of like herding cats.
Feral cats. Hungry, rabid, feral cats. Yes. Yes. And we'll mention it before. Some of them no longer interview. So it's about matching the people who understand why. And some that go completely off script. And just decide to ask the same thing before, or ones that may not understand what you were talking about of the topics that you can't bring up. Like if the applicant brings up, totally fine, let's talk about it, but you can't bring them. It's about finding the right people, and as was mentioned in the last session, if you get some financial compensation for participating in that, recognizing that you really need to pick the right people to pick your next class of residents.
I think too that and at the end, we kind of talk about training faculty, but explaining why you're using this method is really important so they can understand the reasoning behind it and what you're hoping to get out of it too. Can be really helpful, but it can be hard to get the buy-in, right? Because there are people like, this is how I do interviews and I do it this way, right? So there's some flux, and it's kind of ongoing faculty development as well. Not a perfect answer.
A lot of faculty are very coachable.
Yeah.
When you understand why.
Yeah, I think that's it too. It's like bringing them into this. And if you can include them in the process of writing the questions too, so much the better, right? Because then they are invested in that.
And I've changed the questions throughout, like after a year from the feedback of the faculty.
Yeah.
Exactly I love that point of if you get the exact same answer from every single applicant, you're getting nothing new from it. So it's not a good question.
And so that is something that you want to do, right? Elicit feedback from those faculty who participate to say, well, do we need to you say, I did this and the flow was just really weird. Like this order is not working. And you can get some of that in pilot testing, but when you're really doing it in real life, it can be different. And so that feedback from faculty also is very valuable. Like when they're going off script, why?
Let's get through. Yeah, go ahead. We will go into that. 100%. Yes. And I will disclose that we did not do it right the first time. And we've even this last recruitment cycle, we still had some issues, and we recently just fixed it for another transfer recruitment. And it seemed to work so much better. So it is constantly a work in progress. But there's a lot of work that goes into it. So it is definitely iterative. So let's focus a little bit on some examples of the questions. Here is a typical thing. We all want people with exemplified teamwork, right? Anybody not want residents that work well in teams? Good. Okay. So this should be applicable to everybody. So here's an example question. Can you share an example of a time when you had to work as part of a team? What was your role and how did you contribute to the team's success? ChatGPT wrote that one for me.
But
But-
so can any reflecting back, what are the qualities of this? Like that we just had that slide up for a long time. What in here, it makes it a good question? It's open-ended. There's not a right answer. It involves a story.
It's
not
not illegal.
illegal.
Yes. We like that one.
Yeah.
So. Yes. So I'm gonna give you.
Yes.
How about this one, though? Tell me about a team you had worked with well that did not work well together, and how did you act to improve the situation?
So this is one of the variations that's really nice to add in too. This makes it, and this can be a probe question, right, for follow-up. They're like, oh yeah, I got this, teamwork. I was the president of this organization. We had this huge fundraiser, made $1 million. It was great. Everybody went into surgery. Then what about when you were in this dysfunctional team? Just like what you're gonna be entering into. But, right, so that's a twist that you could do on it.
And you can decide, so the first one is one that ChatGPT wrote, the second one is one that we wrote to say, we really want to hone in on this, because I want you to think, I don't want just a canned answer. I want, how reflective were you about that process? How much did you look at a growth mindset of what did I contribute to potentially it not working and be able to push forward? So I wanted to take it to that next step. But this is a harder question to answer, and it can kind of leave a negative taste in the applicant's mouth, right? And so it's a question of the kind of program that you are and what you want to represent too. Of, do you want to have them walk away from your interview day saying, oh my gosh, this was such a great day. I like totally nailed every question. Some of our questions are actually really hard to answer and are a little uncomfortable to answer, but for us, like, we want to really delve into who they are because we want to make sure we have the right people for the right program. So it, there's pros and cons to both, but I would say don't be afraid of exploring, asking negative versions of your questions to really point out, okay, how reflective is the applicant. So there's another example of communication. Sorry for the mix up there. All right. So provide an example of a time your communication skills significantly influence the situation or outcome. It's my ChatGPT question. Versus, what's your approach in a situation when somebody disagrees with you? I've gotten some really great answers to this one. And how does your approach change depending on the person involved? Right? So this is, again, pulling back to a lot of the stuff that we've learned from business. Like, if people understand what I'm saying, like, are you a blue, green, yellow, red? And if you're a blue talking to a green, how is that very different than if you're a blue talking to a red? Like, it depends on who you are, what your own personality style is, and who you're going to engage. If you're an intern and the nurse disagrees with you, how are you going to handle that situation? If it's your attending that disagrees with you, are going to handle it differently than if it's a medical student or a nurse that's disagreeing with you. If a consultant calls you, how do you manage that? How do you actually bring people over? So there's a lot more leadership stuff. Yes, it is communication based, but there's a lot of leadership stuff that's tied into this version of that question. Let's do one little practice one. So for determination, so if you guys were going to write a question about determination, then what do you guys think? I don't have answers for this one. Yes. Yeah, I love that.
That they were not good at.
That's great. Fantastic. So you can see how, like, if that's your core, if you have an issue of people just not leaning into the hard stuff, then asking a question like that's going to be really important. Great. All right. Let me move on for the.
So then how do you score these questions? And this is really hard. Coming up with questions is like pretty fun, and scoring can be more tricky, can be trickier. But so for a scoring rubric, the recommended practice is having between 3 and 7 anchors. Generally, I prefer an odd number to an even number. 5, I think, is a really comfortable. So this is your standard Likert, 1 to 5. The way that you create anchors, you need at least 3. So if you do a 7-point, a 3-point, or a 5-point, you need 3 anchors, top, bottom, middle. Unsatisfactory, so you'd say these are unsatisfactory, satisfactory, and exemplary, however you want to anchor, but generally that's what I use. So 0 is like 1 is like not good. And think about, what would you expect as a poor answer from someone who has little knowledge or skill of this value, job requirement, whatever it is you're looking at? What would you expect their answer to look like? What's an acceptable answer, but maybe not something that's very insightful, or whatever metric you really want to probe in there? And then exemplary, what would you want to hear from an outstanding applicant? What would they tell you? And this is an example of, this is from educational testing, but this is an example of a question with a 7-scale rubric that has 3 anchors. And the question is, tell us about a time when you used your listening skills to overcome a communication problem at work. And someone who would exceed the expected, so average level of performance, they deal with the problem on a case-by-case basis, but doesn't sort out the root cause to fix it. So maybe they had a disagreement with a coworker, they didn't know who was going to do the job, and we just like sorted out. I said, I'm sorry. But they didn't say, maybe we should set up a meeting to schedule when we're going to do assignment of tasks, right? They listen, they ask coworkers' opinions, so that you can kind of get a sense from their story of what they're telling you. From someone who exceeds, they would describe in their story how they paid close attention to the emotional tone, nonverbal behaviors, how they created an atmosphere that was open, that allowed communication. So this might be the candidate might say, well, I approached the person with curiosity and asked them what they thought was happening in this situation. That is an example of that. So it's a little complex because you have to think of, what does the behavior look like, right? And then how do you describe that behavior? Fails to meet performance, like they left the organization, or transferred to another department, like they just ignored it. I just ignored it, and I just avoided working with that person again. Okay, that would be like an unacceptable behavioral. And so as much as you can do to outline exactly what those criteria are that you're looking for, and what those specific behaviors, and they don't have to be as long as this. It can be like 1 or 2 things. So if it's the emotional intelligence piece that you want to pull out that says that's exceptional, the normal one is they address the situation, but they don't really go into depth about how they did it. And then unacceptable would be they just said they avoided working with that person, or I bumped it up to my boss. That's another one, but maybe you'd say that's kind of unacceptable, like, because one day you're the boss. Okay, so putting this into practice, this is a really important part, and I think can be really helpful, is how do you create the flow then within your interview room, and not just start out with a hard question. So the way that we've kind of done it is to do a script for our interviewers. So you start with an icebreaker that's kind of an easier, lighthearted question. Then you follow with 3 questions that outline the core value, that are focused on the core value, and each of those has a probe question that goes with it. A closing question that kind of circles back, because as Dr. Detebu was saying, like some of these questions can be difficult and hard, but you want the applicants to ultimately have a positive experience with your program. So can you bring it back with another question that they feel good about answering, and then give them some time to ask questions, because it is, and I do think to the question about, do you do it all standardized or allow other time? Applicants do want to be seen for the work that they've done. They want to have the opportunity to talk about what's in their CV, what's brought them here, and sometimes it doesn't get picked up in a standardized interview question. They may want to ask specific questions too about the program. So our script looks like this. We give this to all of our faculty ahead of time. We tell them why we're doing this. We give them our core values. I've blanked them out here, so this doesn't end up on the Reddit forum for interviewees. And then we include for our faculty our mission statement around education. Because this is what has helped us establish our values too. And it's important to remind our faculty what we're here to do. So we list that as part of it. And then we give some standard format for how long you should spend on each one. So the initial question is the icebreaker. We list the core value that they're going to be asking about, and we describe the core value. I'm not giving you the answers. You have to generate them yourself. And then the 3 questions with their probes, and then a final question, and then leave a few minutes. And we pretty much tell people, like, this is how we want you to do it. The other nice thing is our coordinators, they make the scoring rubric on a Qualtrics so that the interviewer can look at the Qualtrics and it says, this is the question you're asking, has the rating scale with the behavioral descriptions. So as they're asking the question, they have that there. They could even ask it off the Qualtrics, really. This guide gives them timing to log answers as they go, if that's helpful.
Good answer, bad answer, whatever. Or well, we don't, we ask our interviewers not to say that we're gonna have a keyword session. Then they know like how to do it. So they're gonna be able to get some.
Few notes here of things that we do. We provide bias training for all of our interviewers. So our GME provides training and we have discussions with them as well. And we do standardize the interviewer across applicants. So like we said, we have each of our applicants has 4 20-minute interviews. They meet with 3 faculty members and 1 senior resident in our program. And each applicant will have each of these 4 values in a different room. And we do try to pair our interviewer with the value, but there it is, with the value. So for example, teamwork is a great one for our residents to talk about because they're going to be the ones in the trenches with this person that we're trying to recruit. So we try to look at the faculty that are signed up that day and place them where we think they will best fit. As you mentioned, maybe some people don't want to be doing this or buying into this. I do think it helps a little bit if it feels like the value is connected a little bit closer to them. I also feel like our faculty who don't necessarily buy into this do truly give themselves away because they don't necessarily answer the questions in the Qualtrics closely, or when we're having a post discussion, they'll say, well, I didn't really talk about these questions, but, and so we kind of mentally will note that and know for the future, maybe we shouldn't have this person interviewing, or maybe we need to have just a one-on-one coaching session with this person to make sure that they're buying into it. Because we also want all of our applicants to have the same experience to reduce bias, and so that they're all being asked all the same questions so we can compare apples to apples. So obviously getting buy-in from interviewers. Other considerations, the materials that we provide to the people doing interviews, we don't give them full packets of the applicant's information. We give their CV, their personal statement, and their letters of recommendation. I think I've historically seen that faculty really love to focus on, well, I gave this person a great score because they had really high step scores. Obviously, we know that those scores are kind of going away anyways, but our outlook is if this person is getting in the door for an interview, we have already reviewed those things. They're already qualified to be a resident here. We want you to talk to them and make sure that they are going to be a good contribution to our program. So those are the materials that they receive, and then also responding their reaction to the responses versus a flat affect. Trying to not just judge the applicant on whether they're really enthusiastic or talk too much, just being able to actually get down to the bottom of what the content that they're providing. Yeah, sorry. Um, we do inform our applicants that we are using a standardized process. Dr. Tebe, when she is doing her intro in the beginning of the day, lets them know what they can expect for the day, that they'll all be receiving the same questions. And we do want the buy-in from the applicants as well. We want them to know that this is a holistic process. We're reviewing their application and that we are trying in any way that we can to reduce bias that they might face throughout the day. It is something to think about when you inform the applicants. We think it's a good idea to just tell them the day of. We also will have some interviews at the beginning of their interview. Just say, hey, just so you know, these are standardized questions that we're asking everyone today, and get started. And then you do have to think about what if your questions get released. I do think that there are probably more common questions that all of us are asking on the interview trail. And just thinking about that, whether you want to tweak them or change them, or just be prepared for a little bit more canned response and being able to dig into that a little bit more. Do you want to talk about the pros and cons? Sure. I think pros, it does take away some of the mystery of the interview process. It's maybe not as, oh, I found out this fun fact because we were talking about where we vacation and we vacation at the same place, or our fathers went to the same college and now we connected over this. It takes away some of those pieces, but also it forces you to not be pigeonholed into easier but less informative interviews, like those examples, or we just saw the same movie and let's talk about that the whole interview. And then it's really important to us that we're sending the signal that our program cares about equity and reducing bias. We want everyone to have the same questions. We want everyone to be judged on the same playing field. Some cons, it can be hard to judge how the interview is going, especially if the interviewers practice giving neutral responses. I think that it is sometimes hard for the applicants to be able to read that interview and whether that impacts where they're ranking us or not, or how they feel about the day. I think that can be really difficult. And then you also may miss out on the opportunity to talk about specific things. As Dr. Williams mentioned, they come in wanting to boast about themselves and wanting to talk about these really wonderful accomplishments that brought them to us today. And I think sometimes that can leave a little bit, it can be a miss where they don't get to talk about it. And I think, again, that could leave maybe a sour taste in their mouth, or maybe make them feel like they weren't able to really advertise their best self.
And just to say, these are the applicant perspective. We asked people who have interviewed with us what they thought about the process to understand what their perspective is. And I think that's important if you can do that. And this is like way past match, obviously don't reach out before, but to say, what went well, what was challenging about this? What are people saying about our interview days?
We actually,
And many people, one of the people that we talked to, he said, I actually really valued that it was a standardized interview. Like it was kind of hard and I didn't feel like it was as friendly maybe as some places or as easy as some places, but it made me realize that you really care about being as objective as possible when you interview, and he said it felt like it was very fair that way.
yeah,
So
we actually tried to get him to come down to present, but
did.
he didn't want to give up his time in the SICU because he felt like it was a good experience for him. And like, really? But we did a really good job of recruiting him. I want to recruit 6 of him next year. But it's also to your point of like, how do you split it up, right? Like we let them know. So like their time with me or the time with the chair, the time with the residents for sure, super low key. They get to really enjoy the culture, and our residents sell our program better than any of us ever could. Right. So they hear it from the residents. No, this is really where we go. We also protect the time of the residents. So every single resident gets to actually be there. So we do it during our time, which I think is a huge, but I think it's a red flag if you're interviewing at a program and the residents don't show up or don't go to things. So we have other ways of compensating for the potential awkwardness or difficult aspect of really getting into the delving questions.
Yeah. I think the purpose to the way that we use this within our holistic review process is by the, we do our review of applications before. We know at this point that we're interviewing people who are exceptional, really, like pretty much anyone we interview is going to be a great person. And so this is refining. Can we find alignment with our values and theirs through this, help them make the decision too, really, because this presents kind of what they're seeing as well. And then it also gives us some additional data, as objective as we can be, to help discriminate too. Then when you put that together, which can be really difficult because we're getting less and less objective criteria. And this is not a perfect objective data, like clearly, but it can help to then stratify and differentiate applicants. So it is a really useful tool in that process.
Thoughts from people, other questions that we can get to? Yeah. Okay. Do you really want those people in your program?
I mean,
To be honest,
right.
like they gave you a huge favor right there.
Yeah,
If they don't get it, don't buy in and don't respect the process, then they clearly do not match the culture in which you're trying to go. And one thing that I've had to learn a lot of, and or Mackenzie's had to walk me through many times, is it's not my job to find the absolute best 6 people in the entire world, because there's more than 6. I need to find 6 that are fantastic and are gonna do great, and it's not my job to save the entire world. I'll still try.
Yeah, I think it's a good
But-
vetting resource for us as well. If you're not interested in the way that we're approaching this, you're not going to be interested in our program.
Yeah.
And we're going to probably have problems down the line anyways. These are the standards we hold ourselves to. These are the standards we hold our residents to.
Yeah.
We want to know that during the interview process.
Respond professionally and don't lose any sleep over it and move on.
There are more fish in the sea.
Ooh, that's a great question. I spent way too much time in Excel for
Yeah,
this part.
I will say too, like when we review our applications, we do a preliminary review, we have a score, and then we send over
have-
half of our applicants
yeah.
to faculty to do another review. We get a score from that, and then we have an interview score. So we have a lot of numbers bouncing around.
I don't have a strict answer for that. What I do is like she said, we have 3 scores. I actually created 3 lists depending on the weight. One was equal each one. One was like 30, I think one was like 25, 25, 50, and like another one. And it's really interesting. It really clearly pulls out who's great on paper versus who's great in person. And it helps you get a sense of who's great across the board, because somebody may be pulling way up. We definitely found people who interviewed incredibly strongly, but didn't look great on paper, or people who looked fantastic on paper that didn't interview well. And do you want that person versus somebody who it was maybe slightly less, but across the board? So I actually looked at all 3 lists and lost a lot of sleep over that list. And then figured it out and tailored it and looked at last little tweaks or impressions or whatever else that we're looking for to kind of make the final groupings. I don't have a good answer.
And the
Yeah.
corollary to that is like, and what does that mean about the residents that you end up with and how do they do? And we don't have that information yet because it'll just take time to know. And it's hard to say exactly what the impact of that is and ultimately like who we recruit and retain.
And I think we all know that junior residents are not necessarily like great junior residents are not necessarily great chiefs, and great chiefs are not necessarily great juniors. Right. And it's just an individual process for everybody. But I think if you're finding people who are teachable and excited and curious, then you know you're going to have things to shore up. I have things to shore up. I'm still working on it, right? And so going at it, you want like the growth mindset stuff is where we really kind of focus on.
I know we're over time, so I appreciate you all staying. We got started a couple minutes late. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us too. Thanks for coming. Thank you.
This is yours?
No, this is the conference. Yeah. the
Is this
conference.
your USB?
No, it's also the conference.
Oh.
I think I don't know. All
right.
Yeah, it's all, I think it's probably.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there you go.
The touch.
Okay, I'm just gonna.
Yeah.
It's,
See. I don't know how to do. Hey.
Yes. Okay, well, I didn't think